Business Show. I'm Donal O'Donovan, business editor at the Irish Independent. I'm delighted to be joined here by Professor Luke O'Neill, eminent professor at Trinity College Dublin, businessman, successful businessman indeed, communicator, and I suppose dripping with scientific accomplishments as well. Luke, good afternoon. How are you?
Not too bad, Donal. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you very much. We're here, I guess, to talk about the interaction of science and disease with the economy and society, which we've all had a crash course in over the last 12 months, and is probably not played out yet. But I guess we are now starting to see large cohorts of people being vaccinated, to some extent in Ireland, a little bit faster in some other places, and we're starting to get a sense of what a post-COVID workplace and a post-COVID environment is going to look like. So I suppose the best guide to what's going to happen is very often what's happened in the past. And from a scientific point of view, what have you seen that you would expect to see, sort of, to be able to reference as we move on here?
No, it's a good question. I mean, we know a lot about pandemics through history, obviously. You know, the 1918 pandemic is the one that was the last major one, you know, and that went on for 2-3 years, really, you know. And then we had the explosion of the 1920s, where there's an upsurge in activity, almost like a relief, I reckon now. You know, the Roaring Twenties were a direct result of that pandemic. Not so much the First World War, strangely, because the First World War didn't really affect America that much, you know.
Yeah.
But this thing did. So that we can anticipate a real shift in the next year, 2-3 years, partly because of human nature saying we've had a terrible time with it. And now we've got to get back out there and get our lives.
So people will want that release.
Death is that's a reasonable thing to predict, right? So I'd be optimistic along those lines. More importantly, though, we've got real data at the moment from Israel, because Israel are going gangbusters. I mean, they've vaccinated probably 80% now of their population. They're 80% reopened, Israel now, you know, which is incredible. And you'll see all the metrics, the business metrics and the economic metrics returning in Israel. Now, we're lucky in that we can watch that. Now, they might go back into a lockdown. We still don't fully know, you know. But so far, that vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine in particular, is now really efficacious in Israel. And yet again, the answer to the economic crisis is vaccination. It's very clear. And now we have the evidence from Israel that supports that, you know. So there's good indicators from those sorts of situations.
And we've seen, obviously, workplaces adapt, and people in their workplaces adapt over the last 12 months. Huge amounts of people working from home, where people are working together, a lot of social distancing, a lot of organizational kind of spatial changes, I suppose, in the environments people work in. To what extent would you expect to see that continue? So will the office, the factory floor, the shop floor, will they change permanently, do you think? Or do you think that we could kind of get back to some degree of normality quite quickly?
What's startling, if this pandemic happened 10 years ago, we wouldn't have shut down the economy. We couldn't have. You know, people would have had to go to work physically, you see. I mean, there's a great example of that in the 1918 pandemic again, when the farmers had to keep doing the farming, and that was very labor intensive at that time. There's less mechanization then. Mass spread of that virus because and people had to go to work to get food, you know. So it's a funny one, isn't it? So 10 years ago, we would have probably tolerated more death, basically. We would have had to, you know, because can you imagine? So Zoom comes along, and now we're able to do all this instead. Now the big question is, has remote working worked for people? Now, we'll probably know that in a year or two's time, potentially, if companies suffered because of this. To my knowledge, and you might know better than it hasn't done that much damage for the big corporations, where it's been possible to do it. Clearly, many people who aren't in work, that's devastating for them. And economically devastating, you know. So, but the Irish economy, I keep an eye on it myself, as you know, hasn't done too badly because our sectors could work remotely, basically, and keep productivity up in various ways, you know. Now, if we think about the future, if the economy is working through remote working, I would imagine that will continue. There's no reason not to. That's the first thing to say, right? So it'll be driven more by the staff. They'll want to go back and meet. You know, that might be a bigger driver than economic need for that part of the economy, you know. But on the other hand, I do think there will be a bit of caution. I mean, we know again through history, TV was a scourge in Ireland for decades, remember, and they would actually build buildings to be places where TV wouldn't spread. There was high ceilings, there was good ventilation.
The old national schools had high ceilings, and the old hospitals obviously had the big windows, the high windows.
That was the reason. So I imagine in the future, new workplaces that are being built maybe I'll take this into account just in case another pandemic comes along, And I think we'll be proceeding cautiously, watch for the next 12 months.
For 12 months.
People are going to be scared. And even though the risk is low, they're going to be a bit more cautious in general. So it wouldn't surprise me if we're wearing masks next winter, for instance.
Yeah.
And there may be guidelines in the workplace to have desks spaced in certain ways and so on. That could well be a feature.
You mentioned there that in terms of a shift back from remote working to maybe more centralized working, the staff and the employees will obviously be a big part of that conversation. For employers, though, they're going to have complicating situations. Like, for instance, there is going to be a cohort of people who don't want to take a vaccine.
Yeah.
We know that. I suppose we don't know how big it's going to be. And to some extent, the fact that vaccines are now a very desirable thing for an awful lot of people may shift the conversation around that, I suspect, human nature being what it is. People will want what they can't have. But there will be a cohort who don't want that. There will also be a cohort of people who are, I guess, medically more vulnerable during the return. How, I mean, as an employer, as a biochemist, as a scientist, how is that going to be a manageable situation? Because it's going to be complicated.
I've got a great phrase that's above my pay grade, in a sense. I mean, but nobody's any easy answers to this one. So if you're an employer and you have to bring people back into your workplace and someone is refusing the vaccine, you're putting them at risk then of getting infected, and you have an obligation to them in a way, So will they mandate this? Some companies may well mandate vaccination among their staff. You never know. It'll be controversial, because obviously you're forcing people to do something they mightn't want to do. So it's an unknown that in many ways. Now, of course, if you have 50, 60, 70% being vaccinated, if someone says, I'm not going to be vaccinated, you may get them to sign a waiver to say, I won't sue you if I get infected. That might be part of it,
Yeah.
Because, of course, it's up to them in a way. If they want to risk picking up a very serious infectious disease, that could be their choice, And you say to them, look, here's a vaccine. It will protect you. It's my obligation as your employer to protect you in the workplace. But if you're not going to take it, sign this. That may be one scenario that's being discussed, I think. Now, I guess
the HR specialists and the legal specialists are going to have to look quite hard at really what are the rules and what can and can't be done within the sort of the legal framework that that we do exist within a legal framework.
We do.
And then within sort of the same sort of territory, travel, people may well be restricted from what is essentially the privilege of getting on somebody else's airplane, or getting on somebody else's train within reason, I guess. I mean, what would you expect to see happening there?
You see, because you're not denying someone a basic human right there. Say, you might argue a job is a right.
Yeah.
Say, travel is an option, especially travel in a vehicle that's this way instead of that. So what you might say is, look, of course we're happy that you want to travel and it's within your rights to travel. Of course it is. But sadly, I've decided my airplane, you need to have a vaccine to get on it. I apologize, Go by boat, that kind of thing. So you may see that. Now, remember that in that situation, I've been reading stuff, it's the obligation of the airline to protect the passengers, remember. So they may decide, look, everybody has to be vaccinated because otherwise there's a risk of someone getting infected in my plane, So it may be along those lines you'll see, and I imagine that'll happen. I mean, the prediction is there will be vaccine certificates for travel. And the EU have said this almost. Ursula von der Leyen made a speech last week about this. So we're going to have a travel situation where if you want to travel from Dublin, say to Paris or wherever, you show your certificate when you check in and you take an antigen test at the airport that's negative. And you have to take a second test when you arrive, and that'll be mandated as a condition of travel, if you know what I mean. That's a likely scenario. What they'll do as well, by the way, is they'll designate green countries which have a low level of virus and a sufficient level of vaccination to allow exchange between those countries. It has to come back. I mean, we can't keep Europe locked up for the foreseeable future. And these are reasonable things to propose, you see, and they're scientifically sound things to propose.
Yeah. In terms of the scientific soundness, the speed that vaccines have been delivered has been extraordinary. Beyond, I think, anything that's ever happened historically. I don't know, and you'll know. To some extent, we're coming to a point where they're being road tested in terms of the manufacturing robustness of manufacturing processes. the ability to scale those manufacturing processes and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it looks like the science of the vaccines themselves is very sound.
Yep.
The speed that they've come at has been very sound, but the ability to deliver them consistently on a large scale, that's not quite there.
Yeah, but I mean, you've hit the nail on the head there. I mean, science is delivered. We have the vaccines now. And that moves outside science into technology. And remember, if you're trying to make something, things go wrong. There's glitches, there's all kinds of problems. The regulatory environment is extremely stringent for any medicine or vaccine, remember. So there's all those boxes to tick, if you will, for the companies making the vaccines, which aren't trivial either, by the way, you know. And then they're trying to make, 7 billion vaccine doses? I mean, it's the most amazing. We're going to look back on this time, though, without doubt, and say this is the greatest scientific achievement of the last 100 years.
You really you think so?
I do. And then secondly, the greatest achievement for delivery of a product into a market. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. Like, I think something like 300 million people have now been vaccinated. It's an amazing number in the space of 2 months to see that happen.
With a vaccine that didn't exist 9 months ago, 6 months ago, maybe, yeah.
Or even, you might say, I was relieved in November, Donal. Now you've hit, you've asked the key thing. The quickest vaccine before this was 4 years, you see. That was mumps, right? So we got this vaccine in 10 months. And when the data was released in November, now remember, it was a 40,000 patient trial was run by Pfizer-BioNTech, incredible number of people, the biggest trial ever actually at that stage, done for any medicine or vaccine. And they got the result in November, 95% efficacious. I said, this is fantastic. Because what it meant was this was now a disease that a vaccine would work against. We didn't know that. We never got a vaccine for HIV, you see, or hepatitis C. So that day was a remarkable day. I think 9th of November, I think it happened. And I was on the 6-1 News. I was doing the thing, and they asked me. So I'll never forget it, because I said, yes, now we have the end in sight. It may be a long way up, but the end now is really achievable in a sense. And as you correctly said, the next mission then becomes getting the factories, getting the production up, getting the thing out then, and getting it to all the vaccination centers. And we're still very much in the middle of that.
How complicated is that? Why is that complicated?
I think it's partly because it's just the regulatory environment is very intense, first of all. Like, let's say they change the glass bottle to a different manufacturer. That could take a month to approve that, even though that you might think they're the same glass bottle,
Yeah.
And the reason is to protect the citizens, because these are very, very sophisticated things. Mission one is to discover them, of course it is, and then the other mission is to make sure they're safe. And any change in the protocol, any change in ingredient has to go through massive testing again, you see. And that's why people should never have been anxious. I think I believe the airline industry and the pharmaceutical sector are the most regulated of all. And airlines are obvious. You can't say a plane has a good chance of not crashing, can you?
Yeah.
Equally, you can't say, there's a good chance this vaccine is safe. You've got to do all these stringent things, you see, to make sure that they're going to be safe and efficacious, So for all those reasons, then, there are many challenges here. But remember, you've got to remember, these companies know what they're doing. I mean, Johnson & Johnson is one of the biggest vaccine makers in the world, and then they've now come up with their great vaccine. Pfizer, huge vaccine company. So you're going to the right people, basically. Yeah. AstraZeneca, strangely, and perhaps to its cost, it doesn't make vaccines, Right. So they've had a bit more trouble because they're not used to it, I suppose. So there's different elements going there in the background to do with these different companies.
What's the AstraZeneca situation is interesting because everyone has kind of had their stake on it, from the German press, German politicians. Is a sort of a European political discussion around AstraZeneca. There's obviously the scientific discussion around AstraZeneca. What's as a person who's kind of grounded in the science of it and who understands the science of it, what's your view of the discussion that we've been having around vaccine rollouts?
Yeah.
I mean, that can't just be a discussion for scientists, obviously, because it is ultimately a political decision to do these things. But I guess it's an area where people have to tread quite warily. Yeah,
it's unfortunate, AstraZeneca, really, what's happened there, because it is a great vaccine. Let's start with that. And I'm very close to that vaccine because I know Adrian Hill. He's the head of the institute. I had a huge collaboration with him for years on malaria. There's a poor man who'd spent 20 years trying to get a malaria vaccine, didn't get very far. But now, of course, with COVID, he's really delivered on his vaccine expertise. That's just great. Yeah. So very efficacious vaccine. I think the problem was AstraZeneca are not a vaccine company. It's a strange one. Now, by the way, people probably don't know this. When they discovered the vaccine in Oxford, in a university, remember, it was a university that discovered this vaccine, not a company. Adrian with the team goes to the head of the university, a woman called Louise Richardson, and he said, we think we got a vaccine for COVID. She said, well, first of all, we will give this away for free to the world. That's the first thing. We're a university. We're not going to do massive profits. And AstraZeneca were the only company who took it up to produce it for zero profit.
Right.
They may make a profit in 3 or 4 years with boosters and all kinds of things, but AstraZeneca took it on. So credit to them. But the challenge was they're not really a vaccine company.
So on the manufacturing of vaccines, they weren't there.
Absolutely. They don't have a big factory to make millions and millions of doses of vaccine. Now, of course, what's happened, by the way, and you've seen this now, marvelous collaboration between companies, which is unprecedented, and Sanofi is going to help them. And, we see Merck helping Johnson & Johnson and all these interrelationships, which were unprecedented in the industry for competitive reasons, I mean, the analogy I use, Donal, is it's like Pepsi agreed to make Coke for a while. It's that kind of thing,
Yeah.
And because it's great, and the reason they're doing it, and they're getting paid for the course, by the way, it's not as if they're doing it for nothing, but it's great because they know it's an emergency. We've got to make these vaccines by the billion, So to see companies collaborate, tremendous like that.
Has the speed that, and I suppose, I mean, the speed was very much prompted by the costs, the global costs of this pandemic, which are unprecedented, I think, in financial terms. And obviously, there's a human cost beneath it all. The human cost is not unprecedented in epidemic terms. We've had much worse crises, and the response, I suppose, is the reason for that. But economically, it's unprecedented. Has that changed the way that universities collaborate? That universities collaborate with industry, that industry collaborates, industry rivals, as you say, collaborate with each other. Has that changed in a way that you think might stick, or is that a one-off?
I hope so. I mean, to be honest, in the pharma sector, they've always been saying they should collaborate more anyway. They call this open access. They call this pre-competitive stuff, and that they've always felt that was a good thing because it might speed up progress. And okay, you might have to divvy the profits between you, but at least you found a drug for cancer or whatever it is, So that wasn't happening. So there's been attempts to try to get companies to work more and more in collaboration, and you do see more of it anyway. I mean, GSK are with Sanofi for their vaccine development program, the 50-50 arrangement there. GSK has given its what's called an adjuvant away. So vaccines have this additive which boosts the immune system. They're called adjuvants. GSK have the best adjuvant in the world. They're sharing it with the companies. Now, they will get a return on that sharing, of course, And then in academia, we've always collaborated, really, anyway. Academics are inclined to be more collaborative because I suppose there's less of a commercial consideration there. And then loads of interaction with industry. Of course, they've always come to us anyway. And as you know, I've had many connections with industry over the years because they need our expertise, you see. So we're hoping this will represent a shift. And look what can be done, Donal. I mean, you've got to remember, back in February, say, this time last year, kind of, we all knew this is a massive emergency. We all wanted to play our part, honest to God. And my lab, then, we switched over 3 projects into COVID. And many labs around the world in immunology did that, simply because we knew there was an emergency here. Now, that was a risk because it's very competitive then, and you might lose the competition, So, and
I guess in your industry, or in your academic work, people do dedicate 5, 10, 20 years, as you say, to search for something, and to then stop that in order to do something else. Presumably, at a human level, is a bit of a wrench.
It is a wrench, yeah. And if in my lab in particular, now we've been working on, my main area is therapeutics, therapies. So we work on anti-inflammatories is my big area. And once we realized COVID is an inflammatory disease of the lungs, effectively the lungs get very inflamed, we could say, look, our ideas might apply to COVID, So it wasn't quite that we sort of stopped something entirely. We kind of applied what we were doing already into COVID. If I say so myself, we're getting some very interesting data. So it's going well, But then many labs are in the thick of this. And I mean, the other thing I'd say, Don, is the people in the lab love it. They're young and, they're idealistic and they want to work on something big, don't they? This is the biggest game.
And this is the biggest thing in the world.
It's the biggest game in biomedicine ever, really, in some ways. Now, HIV, I used to work on HIV in the 80s. That was a big one for obvious reasons, It's the biggest thing since HIV, which, as you may remember, was a massive frightening thing at the time, So you can't be getting younger people engaged in that way. It's tremendous in many ways.
Yeah. And do you see that? Are you seeing that at the very? I mean, science has answered the problem, as you say, in the last 12 months. Does that reflect in CAO applications? Does it reflect in interest in science?
Well, for me personally, the number of emails and letters I get off young people asking about, oh, I want to do a job in immunology. How do I do it? The stuff, I've given loads of talks to schools. Like every week, I give 2 or 3 talks. Now they're 20-minute things. It isn't, it's not that much trouble to me. But to secondary schools and even primary schools, I've done lots of talks because the teachers know the kids are engaged. I had 2 big thrills, Donal. One was 2 pupils in different schools named me as their person of the year last year. Isn't that nice? And they did a project with my picture and all this and got stuff off the internet. That was nice. I mean, for me personally, my mission is to turn people onto science at every level.
Yeah.
That includes young people. So it's a real opportunity for us to get the message out that science is great,
And you seized it. I mean, and presumably that's conscious. I mean, you've put a lot of time into the communication of science in the last 12 months.
Well, I was conscious. I've been asked to do it. People say to me, "You're always on the telly." They ask me. I never volunteer for any of this. And then it becomes a case of how much time have I got, because 90% of my time is spent on the day job, which is my own lab and all the stuff I'm doing anyway. And then I say yes. I say no to an awful lot of it. I mean, I've some days when 3 or 4 of them are onto me, looking for me to appear. Now, to be honest, Donal, it's an honor, and I'm delighted to do. It's a privilege. And it is something that we have to do as scientists. We should be communicating science to the public for lots of reasons. And COVID is the time to do it in many ways, because, as you know, the appetite is massive. People are very anxious and concerned in all kinds of ways. Why wouldn't I be using my skills to inform them, and help them in a sense,
And I mean, your own lab obviously was involved. Other labs in other universities around the country were involved. There's a big pharmaceutical industry in Ireland. A lot of the big pharmaceutical industry or companies obviously have significant presence here. How involved was Ireland in terms of the overall response?
It was involved a bit, yeah. Now again, as you know, Ireland has many production. So my dealing with the big pharma is more research based. So for example, I had a big link to GSK, link to Pfizer over the years, but that'll be in the US, mainly the UK, I myself, we didn't do much with Irish subsidiaries or whatever, because that's mainly production. Now, other people do. UCD have a massive connection through bioprocessing and stuff, so it's great. No, they've made ingredients in the vaccines for a start, Yeah. And one really good example is Eli Lilly. They discovered a new antibody to treat COVID. That's getting made in Ireland, So there is good interconnectedness with the Irish pharma sector and COVID. I guess the big controversy, Donal, is should we not be making the vaccines here, because we need them desperately.
On the ground, yeah.
Now it turns out it would take a good few months to redeploy a factory into a vaccine-making factory. It could be done, though. I mean, I've been saying this over the last few weeks. I'd love the government to be a bit more punchy in terms of getting more vaccine into Ireland. Maybe one thing is to go and do a deal with Pfizer and say, look, what do you think, guys? We'll subsidise you, whatever it is, because it's such an important thing to do,
And obviously there is a very strong background in pharmaceutical manufacturing here. So like the plants are state of the art.
They are, and they make vaccines in some of these plants. They make biologics. We're in the world of biologics, it's called, by the way. Like Grange Castle is the biggest biologic campus in the world, which Pfizer owns. So it's tremendous capacity here to do some of this. I guess what Pfizer would say would be, well, look, we're making our drugs in those factories, and we can't cut the supply off because we'll lose profit. We can either build a new factory from scratch or redeploy a factory somewhere else. So it's a matter for those companies to discuss it, really. On the other side, though, I'd say the government should be going to Russia and China to buy some vaccine.
Yeah.
That's probably more feasible, as a thing to do.
That's an interesting, I suppose, aspect of the response is, like, obviously at the moment in Europe, it's the European and US vaccines that are being used and have been taken up first. The Russian vaccine seems to have gotten off the ground really, really quickly, and they seem to be manufacturing it on a huge scale. China, the same thing, I guess. Yeah. It feels a bit like the sort of the world is divided in terms of vaccines. Is that right assessment, and should it be?
It is divided, and if you look what other countries have done, like Argentina went to Russia, so their main supply of vaccine is Sputnik V. Other countries in the Middle East have gone to China. Now they're calling this vaccine diplomacy in a way, because they're saying it's in China's interest to do a deal with the Middle Eastern country for various political reasons as well as health reasons. So it does get a bit fraught, this, I suppose. But I know, like, Hungary have done a deal with the Russians on the Sputnik V, for instance, which is tremendous. So deals can be done, as in every business. You can do a deal with people, And remember,
and as far as you're concerned, these vaccines are just as good as the vaccines that you're going to get within.
Well, there was a case for caution because they didn't release the data. We didn't see a lot of phase 3 data, it's called. But now we've seen lots of data from those vaccines, and all three, and they've been in millions already. I mean, Hungary took a great decision. They said, if a vaccine's been in 1 million people and there's no safety issue, we will use it in Hungary. That kind of thing,
Right.
you know. So the fact they're in the real world now, outside trials, and they're showing efficacy and safety, that's tremendous. So I'd be knocking on the door, because the only way we can get the economy back in Ireland and the rest of the world is through vaccination. There's no doubt about that now. So
We can't stay locked down. It's not realistic.
No, so mission one is to get as many people vaccinated. And as I say, the Israelis are telling us this is the solution already. So that's the way to think of it. So I would be more aggressive in terms of trying to get more vaccine into Ireland. But the thing is, I mean, we are getting our 11 million from the EU. That's great. Obviously, we're signed up. That's fantastic. Without the EU, we'd have no vaccine, is it?
Yeah.
But the trouble is, there are issues about supply chains, and that'll happen. Any production, there's glitches, you know. So we should be really thinking, how can we make up for a supply chain problem, say, by buying 500,000 doses off Sputnik V. So I'd be looking into that.
And is it a one-off? Do we get vaccinated and that's it, or are these like to be vaccines that we need sort of recurring access to, and therefore, as you say, manufacturing it here or having the access to the widest supply chain is maybe a long-term thing?
Absolutely, and I've no doubt it'll be a yearly vaccination campaign. Certainly, we'll see children being vaccinated, provided all the safety measures are in place. And they're testing vaccines in children. They're approving it in the over 16s already in the US, the Pfizer vaccine, for instance. So we will see children being vaccinated routinely, you know. And then secondly, older people will get a booster probably every so often. It mightn't be every year. It might be every 2 or 3 years. We don't know. It's a bit of an unknown that whether we need to get booster shots. That's the next question. But I would predict there will be a need for boosters, mainly because of these new variants that are coming along. We'd be foolish not to, and they're already making the vaccines to those, to be honest. All of these companies have already got them in production, you know. So why don't we set up a factory in Ireland? Even if it came online in 12 months' time, there's going to be a big market for these vaccines into the future. No doubt about that.
Professor Luke O'Neill, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much for joining us here. Thanks to the audience, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the day. There's obviously lots of talks going on lots of stages. I'm Donal O'Donovan, and this is The Business Show. Thank you very much.